Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Habarigani. This is Sister Thage welcoming you to the liberated zone of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist and internationalist world affairs program with the spirited music mix. We're running a tight ship this fun drive hour with our central theme of Black education, highlighting the work of Black women scholarship. Our agenda for today, May 3rd, 2025. Prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Noliwe Rooks, L. Herbert Belu University professor at Brown University in Rhode Island, and author of the book Integrated: How American Schools Fail Black Children. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Charise L. Cheney, Professor of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon, and author of the book Blacks Against Brown: The Intra-racial Struggle Over Segregated Schools in Topeka, Kansas. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Sap Mama, The Roots, McCoy Tyner, Les Nubians, Erykah Badu, Nas, and more. And now we'll go to our brother Gary Baca, who's about to highlight why we do what we do here at Freedom Now for everybody across the radioverse and in the community here locally, here at Freedom Now. So sit back, phone in to pledge your support, and as always, we stand ready for revolution. Take it away, Brother Gary.
Once again, we're back for Freedom Now, 818-985-5735. We're in our fund drive, our spring fund drive, and it lasts only 2 weeks. If you haven't pledged for Freedom Now, this program hosted by Dr. Gerald Horne, please call now and pledge your support for this incredible historian. 818-985-5735. Gerald Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. In 1992, Horne was a candidate for the U.S. Senate on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He has published exclusively on W.E.B. Du Bois and has written books on neglected episodes of world history, including Hawaii and the Pacific. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice, in particular, communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. Much of his work highlights and analyzes specific individuals in their historic contexts, such as Lawrence Dennis, a man described as the brains behind American fascism. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, and your dollars go to support this programming, the programs here on KPFK, future programs, and the training of youth here at KPFK for the next generation. You are bringing KPFK into the future by calling 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Currently, I'm training young people. Just recently, I spoke at a high school for young kids in media relations at Dorsey High School in Los Angeles. It was an hour class, and I told the youth how important the media is to the community and my struggle in getting to where I'm at now. I believed in this station so much that I would do anything, and I'm still like that to this day. I would do anything for this station to keep it alive. I'm a yes man. Whenever I get a request or someone needs help here at the station, I always say yes, or always find a way to make it happen. And I think that's why some of us are so valuable, is that we're not no men. We don't say, nope, can't do it. And believe me, there's people here at Pacifica that did that are no longer here. They were just like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't broadcast from there. No, we can't make it happen. No, we don't have the dollars. No, we don't have the equipment. that was said, and it was accepted, and it's still accepted to this day because we are on a budget, on limited funds. But if we can try to make it happen with hard work, dedication, volunteering, putting our time into it, we can make it happen. Not everything is about money. This is blood, sweat, and tears. If you believe in that statement, if there was a way that you can put your money into activism, here it is. 818-985-5735. We're in for the big fight. These 3.5 years are going to be tough, but we're going to be right here with you. 818-985-5735 and pledge your support at any amount. $25 to Dr. Gerald Horne and Freedom Now would be appreciated. Imagine if we could get at least 10 of you to pledge $25. That would be over $200. 818-985-5735. Imagine pledging $200 and we can make a match out of that. You can challenge someone else who listens to Freedom Now to pledge $200. If you pledge that $200, we can make $400 and double our money. 818-985-5735. 818-985-KPFK. Let me say it slowly. 818-985-KPFK or pledge online at kpfk.org. Now back to Freedom Now.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Noliwe Rooks, L. Herbert Ballou University professor at Brown University in Rhode Island, and author of the book Integrated: How American Schools Failed Black Children. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now. KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Rooks.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, why did you write this book, and how have U.S. schools failed Black children?
Well, thank you for the question. So, I had long been sort of thinking about, in terms of why I wrote the book, I had long but kind of been thinking about what seemed to me to be clear resistance, multi-generational resistance to implementing workable solutions to the problem of segregated schools. And I just couldn't quite get to why was it so hard to find large-scale successful examples of this law working. And then I stumbled upon one day, just sort of looking through Black newspapers, something that I didn't know, which was Black people in Topeka, Kansas. So Brown v. Board of Education, which is the impetus for school integration. It's the 1954 the Supreme Court ruling that says it is illegal, it's unconstitutional to maintain separate school systems based on race, funded by taxpayer dollars. And I was doing some work around that, and somehow had never known that Black people in Topeka, Kansas, the named school district in the suit, had fought against the NAACP for the better part of 2 decades in the state to try to keep them from winning this landmark ruling. They hired lawyers in both Wichita and Topeka, the 2 largest cities in the state. Black people hired lawyers to litigate against the NAACP. They collected the dollars in churches, passed the hat to raise money to keep from having to think about integrating their schools. And the reason that they did so, and this was sort of the light bulb that went off, that led to the book that I ended up writing, the story I wanted to know more about. Their argument really was that as a separate but equal school district coming out of Reconstruction or post-Reconstruction, as Southern slave-owning states began to reinstitute Black inferiority and white supremacy, began to institute Jim Crow segregation. In education, states did different kinds of things, generally having separate but unequal systems, 2 systems that could not educate Black people using the same amount of resources that the state would provide as white children. received. But Kansas went in a different direction and said, we will do separate but equal. And they actually lived up to the equal. They spent the exact same amount of money on Black schools, on Black teachers, materials for Black schools. There was no difference. And the communities there thrived educationally, loved their schools, and so thought that this idea of integration where Black children would not know love as a defining central feature of education was something that they needed to fight. So that's a long way of saying I wrote the book because I was trying to figure out what those folks in those communities knew that I felt like I needed to know. And also, how come I didn't know that Black people were fighting against that and had proposed an entirely different way of going about integrating schools if we decided that's what we wanted to do?
So what role do your grandparents play in your book?
So the way that I decided to tell the story was both as just U.S. educational history and legal history, what happened, where, who fought, what kind of fight. But one of the things that I had grown up knowing, my grandparents were teachers in the segregated South in Clearwater, Florida. My grandmother was a reading teacher. She taught the little ones, as she always said, elementary school kids. And my grandfather was a political science teacher, and then went on to be an administrator. And growing up, I knew one narrative just as lived experience about the impact of Black teachers because I grew up in a community of teachers. All of their friends were Black teachers. And they, talked about education. They talked about Williams Elementary around the corner. And I knew that they were held in some regard by Black community members because I would be out in public with them and hear, thank you so much for this, or, let me tell you about that child of mine. And I could not find their reality, the stature and significance of who they were in Black communities in a lot of the literature. And so as I was uncovering parts of educational history about Brown v. Board, once I realized there was something I didn't know, I turned to my own family and started with my grandparents to tell the story of the role they played in integrating Pinellas County in Florida, but also the role they played in educating Black children. And the line that my grandfather mentioned to my mother once was they fought for integration. They were both members of the NAACP. My grandfather was in the leadership of the NAACP in Florida. And so he was on the front lines of thinking about integration. But he told my mother once, daughter, I worry they're not going to love our children over there. And so the story of integration that I tell through my grandparents, through the chapters focused on them, are about Black teachers and the idea of love as central ingredient in education for Black children, a kind of formulation that I talk about that just doesn't appear in contemporary times. As we talk about education, we don't talk about love as central to it. So my grandparents, I guess the role they play is to connect the idea of love with education in Black children.
And what about your father? What role does he play in your pages?
So my father it exemplifies that first generation of children. I mean, I tell the family story of that generation of children who were the first to integrate predominantly white institutions. Most people would probably know Ruby Bridges, for example, who integrated or desegregated a school in New Orleans. And because the white parents refused to let their children attend a school with any Black children, she sat in a classroom by herself for a year. I mean, New Orleans was like, Louisiana was like, sure, fine. She can walk through the doors of the school, but no one would sit with her other than one teacher. That's a story that gets reproduced all over the South of that first contact when those students enter those schools. People are calling out the National Guard. They're calling out the actual military, like battle-hardened military. The 101st Airborne are called into Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 because of the resistance to the idea of brown. So in humanizing that a little bit more, I mean, that's a pretty human part of it, because I do try to tell the stories of those children who were children wanting school, and the resistance, the violent resistance that they faced. But my father had only ever at the point at which he faced integration, had only been in predominantly Black schools. He'd only been in predominantly Black schools with high quality Black teachers, high quality schools that were sending in. A lot of people I've talked to somehow don't know that there was such a thing before Brown v. Board, that there were Black schools and Black teachers operating at the highest level, and that Black students were going off to colleges well prepared and able to compete. So he left K-12 and went to Howard University, where he spent 4 years and majored in economics and philosophy, and then was going off to law school and was recruited to go to the Golden Gate College of Law out in California, which is where he meets my mother, out in San Francisco. And it was the first time he had ever had the experience of having teachers that did not think he was capable. Not that didn't think that, there were things that he might need to learn, things that he might need to sharpen. But as my mother tells me the story of that period and the little bit of conversation I had with him, he had teachers who fundamentally did not think that he was intelligent. And perhaps maybe not even human. The story that I tell in the book, one of the stories about him, is he went off to law school. Had always been on the dean's list. Had always been considered, one of the brightest of his group. And in law school, you had assigned seating, and the professors would just call on you by name, and you just had to jump up and answer whatever question they asked you about the readings, about the assignments. And what my father said was he would answer the questions to the best of his ability and always be told that it just wasn't quite good enough, that he needed to rethink, that he needed to do just a little more work on his analysis. And then he would hear rephrasings of his exact same argument, analysis, offering come out of the mouths of his white classmates, and his white classmates would be told they were brilliant regularly. And that over time, the way I talk about him in the book is that he had just not been built for an integrated society. He had not, he had softnesses. He believed in his humanity. He believed in his intellect in the face of a system that was committed to denying him that. And it became something he couldn't overcome. It became a defining feature for him. He left law school without finishing, and he could never quite pull himself back together after that experience, fully pull himself back together, and he succumbed to drinking. And that's not anyone's fault. Like, it's not me pointing a finger. Some people said, so now you're going to blame people for your father having a problem with alcoholism. It's not. It's just the result of that experience for him was that he couldn't handle it, and there are other children who could not handle that moment. So he gets to exemplify some of that in the book.
And what role do you, Professor Rooks, play in your book?
Yeah, so my parents got divorced when I was 5, and their custody arrangement meant that I bounced back and forth between Clearwater, Florida, and San Francisco, California on a yearly basis. I spent 1 year one place and the next year the other place. And in 1 year, in the 5th grade, I found myself being amongst the first group of students to integrate a school in Pinellas County. Pinellas County, it's not until 1972 that they actually, that the Klan stands down. It's the literal Klan that is blocking integration in this part of Florida. And they stand down in 1972. And so by 1974, I am integrating a school. I am one of a handful of students, Black students, who get on a little yellow bus in the morning and, are driven about maybe 30 minutes or so out to Skycrest Elementary. And one of the things that was interesting about this, I'm integrating a school in the South. It was a brand new school. I'm amongst the first Black children to walk in, but it's not a dramatic story. That we see, that any of the students saw. There were no signs. There was no protests. There was no military. Inside the school, there was I was completely tolerated. No one was spitting on me, shoving me, treating me poorly. I was completely tolerated, but I wasn't accepted. I didn't have friends. We weren't going to each other's house. We weren't sharing intimacies. We weren't, we had I learned how to square dance and some other skills, life skills. But what it taught me was what was required of me as a Black person to be in a predominantly white environment and navigate it without provoking upheaval, without provoking people against me. And I was in the 5th grade, so at 11. And these weren't lessons that anyone sat down and said, so this is how you navigate. But and by that point, enough time had passed and enough history had passed that I think everyone in the building had some sense of how we wanted this experiment to go and what we didn't want to have happen. And we all walked those eggshells for that year. The year after that, my mother had this idea. My mother had gone to public schools in San Francisco and was a big supporter of public schools. And we lived in a high poverty area at the time. Now it's like a rich area, but Potrero Hill was a high poverty area. It's where we live. And so she decided to send me to the local middle school, which was walking distance from the house. But this is right at the time that the Justice Department is making a turn toward juvenile justice in educational settings, having more police officers. Nixon is telling folks that, we need to get tough on crime in these high poverty schools. So my story of integration is one of experiencing the privileges of a high quality, well-resourced, well-organized school environment. And then the next year going to a school environment that's highly segregated, and filled with overwhelmingly poor people, where there probably were as many police in the school as teachers. We didn't always have teachers. Teachers would be there 2 weeks and then leave. You never invested in learning their names because they weren't going to stick around. They basically told us that nothing much good was going to come of us. And as I talk about it, I say that's the only time I ever tried to fight a teacher. It's the only time I found myself in a police car. The environment that I found myself in and the lack of care and the lack of education and learning and input gave me a kind of insight into the kind of schools that the majority of Black kids have actually ended up going to.
And what about your son, Professor Rooks? What role does he play in your book?
Yeah, so my son is the last generation. Since I do not have grandchildren yet, I have no story to tell about them. My son has always been raised in integrated. He was always an only lonely. The term that I use, I talk about is only lonely. Is one of a handful of Black kids. He was always after elementary school in an honors AP kind of track. And he was the only Black boy ever in that kind of track. Sometimes there would be a girl. I don't think there were any Latinx people that I recall for those years at school. But Jelani, my son Jelani, is completely integrated. He didn't have these experiences of this being an oddity, of being like the first one to walk into a predominantly white class. He was raised in Princeton, New Jersey. He was all of his white friends' only Black friend, though. He was accepted to that extent that he was allowed into the homes of his friends. He shared family time. He went on vacations. But he would tell us how from time to time, he just got tired of wearing the mask. And the first time he said that to us, we got him to some Paul Laurence Dunbar pretty quickly to share with him a poet who had put this in some language about what it means to wear the mask. But he said, he knew he had to be upbeat. He knew he had to be funny. He was an athlete. He knew that was a big piece of why he was accepted. He didn't have all of the language for kind of the totality of what that experience was for him, but his being the only Black child in a predominantly white environment, educationally, he could compete. Culturally, he could compete, but he had to get used to, he had to rebuild himself after hearing people use the N-word in different ways. I mean, this was the time when gangster rap was big. I mean, he was born in 91, so gangster rap, and people are using the N-word regularly, and he is one of these folks who grew up not finding the N-word to be necessarily a provocation until he started hearing it come out of some of his friends' mouths in ways that he knew was meant to be a provocation, was meant to disrespect, to wound. And so he had to figure out how to navigate these kinds of situations and settings where he had friends who would say things, would call other children the N-word. And then when he would express concern, would say, but I don't think about you like that. I don't mean you, I mean them. And his trying to navigate and understand what is the difference between you and them in a collective sense as he's growing up in a white world, in a white educational setting, is the story that I offer to explain a more kind of contemporary engagement with desegregation.
So what next for Professor Rooks on your research agenda?
I tend to bounce back and forth. I do projects on Black women. This is not even intentional. It just seems like this is how things work out. So I do projects on Black women in material culture, biographies, different kinds of ways of engaging them. And I do an educational project, bouncing back and forth. And I was thinking, I really need to bounce back to a kind of biography, a kind of close-up engagement with a figure. And I'm looking a little bit at the Children's Defense Fund. We'll see. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking about some things in that realm.
Finally, Professor Rooks, author of the book Integrated: How American Schools Failed Black Children, would you recommend that the youth in our audience perhaps study at Brown University in Rhode Island?
Look, Brown is a fine school. It's a combination Research One University and liberal arts college, which just means it's small enough that you actually get real engagement with your professors. Most classes are small. I have no issues with recommending that people study at Brown University. It seeks to make students feel comfortable and be responsive. The issue is it also had a drop of 40% of Black students for the class of 2028 last year, and they haven't released the numbers for this year. So I don't actually know how possible it will be for Black children to get into Brown in the coming years. It's not clear what they are or are not doing that they're calling complying with the 2023 Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action that has caused these numbers to drop. I don't know exactly. I mean, I know that they're no longer practicing affirmative action. I don't know what they were doing before, so I can't, like how they were operationalizing that, so I can't say what they stopped doing. But while I can say if Black children got in, It's an institution that is designed to offer the support and encouragement across race and gender to all students who are here. But it is a little concerning that they seem to be hardcore about the ability of Black children to come.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
818-985-5735. You are listening to Freedom Now with Dr. Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne is one of the most gifted and insightful historians on racial matters of this generation. When we talk about Dr. Horne, many of his books use an individual as a prism to inspect the historical forces of their times. Horne has also produced broad canvas chronicles of infrequently examined periods and aspects of the history of white supremacy and imperialism. For example, he has written on the post-Civil War involvement of the U.S. ruling class, slavery in Brazil, which was not legally abolished until 1888. He has also written on the historic relationships between African Americans and the Japanese in the mid-20th century, specifically examining the ways in which the Japanese state gained sympathy and solidarity from people of color by positioning themselves as the leaders of a global war against white supremacy. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, or pledge online at kpfk.org. You get your history lesson right here. It's like being in class. You learn so much, and there's no fee. That's the great thing about it, right? You can learn so much from KPFK. It's like being in a class. While some folks spend thousands on education, you get your education right here on KPFK. 818-985-5735, and go ahead and pledge at any amount and say, you know what, I've learned something. Let me give you guys $40. Let me give you guys $100. Let me give you a $250 pledge so that way someone could match that and we can make $500. 818-985-5735. Call that number. And it's very special for someone to be on the mic and to historically take us back and take the time to tell us these facts, these stories about history that some of us want us to forget. But I don't really believe that. People criticize all the time on why we are bringing up the past. Well, if you don't know the past, you don't know the future. You can't repeat what has happened before, such as what Trump is doing now. He's repeating the past. All these dictators, all these oligarchs, the people that don't care about the middle class or poor, homeless, they're right now in office. 818-985-5735. Folks trying to make a better life for themselves, escaping abuse, escaping gangs, drugs, and they come here so they could be in solidarity with us and make this country a better place to live. We're trying. And if you're there, right there with us, thank you so much. We applaud you because we're one and the same, fighting the fight, fighting oligarchy. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. And some of the great Gerald Horne books that are out now that you can get are Black and Red, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Afro-American Response to the Civil War. How about Communist Front, the Civil Rights Congress, 1946 through 1956. Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party. Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising and the 1960s. From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965 to 1980. Published on the University of North Carolina Press. Class Struggle in Hollywood, Moguls, Mobsters, Stars, Reds, and Trade Unionists, 1930 through 1950. Published by University of Texas Press. Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. All great books. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Pledge your support for him writing Black and Brown, African Americans and the Mexican Revolution, 1910 through 1920, published by New York University Press in 2005. The Final Victim of the Blacklist, John Howard Lawson, Dean of the Hollywood 10, University of California Press. The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War. Incredible book. And each and every week, Dr. Horne gives us an insight from his books and history. U.S. American history. 818-985-5735. Mau Mau in Harlem, the U.S. and the liberation of Kenya. The color of fascism, Lawrence Dennis. Racial passing and the rise of right-wing extremists in the United States. The end of empires, African Americans, and India. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Or how about this? The bittersweet science, racism, racketeering, and the political economy of boxing. The counter-revolution of 1836, armed struggle, Panthers and communists, black nationalists, and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Jazz and justice, racism, and the political economy of the music. White supremacy, confronted, U.S. imperialism and anti-communism versus the liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela, put out by International Publishers, 2019. Dr. Horne is a treasure, and we learn more. And if you have not heard of Dr. Gerald Horne or this show, Freedom Now, tune in every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. How about this book, Black Revolutionary, William Patterson and the Globalization of the African American Freedom Struggle, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow, Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii, published by the University of Hawaii Press. The Color of Fascism, Black Revolutionary, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during slavery, Blows Against the U.S. Empire, Imperialism in Crisis, put out by International Publishers. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Call now or pledge online at kpfk.org. Back to the show.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Charise L. Cheney, Professor of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon, and author of the book Blacks Against Brown, The Intra-Racial Struggle Over Segregated Schools in Topeka, Kansas. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Cheney.
Thank you for inviting me to this discussion.
Well, thank you for accepting. And what was Brown versus Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court case in 1954, and what impact, if any, did it have on Jim Crow U.S. apartheid? And why did you decide to write a book about it?
Brown versus Board of Education, there are tons of legal scholars who are, better equipped to unpack the nuances of that Supreme Court decision, but in essence, it made it unconstitutional to segregate public schools. I wrote about the case not in terms of the legal decision per se, but I focus on the Topeka public schools and the activism around whether or not Black Topekans wanted to keep the schools segregated or all Black, or if they wanted to integrate elementary school students.
Mm-hmm. Now, on page 180, you say, quote, that this case was a defeat for the nation's Black teachers. How so?
So, because of segregation, college-educated Black folks had very few occupational opportunities, and one of which the large majority of those who were college educated were kind of funneled into these segregated spaces, the biggest one of which is, public schools. So when I talk about Brown versus Board being a defeat for Black educators, once schools were desegregated, there was a one-way flow into these quote unquote integrated spaces, or the predominantly white spaces. And that was Black students into white spaces. Another example is that white students were not being integrated into Black schools. So for Black educators, that meant that they were not employed in the schools that were being desegregated because of these presumptions about Black intelligence and resistance to proximities to Black bodies. So most Black teachers lost their jobs, even more so Black administrators.
Mm-hmm. And I take it that that ties into your concept of Black school preservationists, correct?
That is correct. So I argue that these Black advocates for all Black schools were attempting to preserve Black educational spaces for Black students and Black educators. So as opposed to saying like anti-desegregationists, I thought it was just easier to say Black school preservationists. And in Topeka, which I argue is probably from an historical perspective, as you know, the narrative around Brown versus Board of Education has evolved. Most people think of Topeka as being like the test case. Now, obviously, there were 5 cases. There were 4 other cases. It just so happened that the Brown case was foregrounded, with the NAACP litigation before the Supreme Court. But in Topeka, the schools were relatively equal, which is why the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was most interested in the Topeka case. The reason that these Black Topekans could advocate in large part to maintain these all Black elementary schools was because the Topeka school board maintained equal-ish funding for Black schools. So the 4 Black schools in Topeka were not underfunded like a lot of schools, a lot of Jim Crow schools. They had modern facilities. They shared curriculum for the most part with their white counterparts. Educators in Black schools were, relatively speaking, had the same salaries as their white counterparts. And so what was able to develop in Topeka were these educational institutions that were semi-independent. The Topeka School Board did not have a lot of oversight or was not that interested in what was going on in these schools. So Black educators had, the freedom to create curriculum or to develop curriculum that challenged anti-Blackness. So, for example, at Washington Elementary, they, sung the Black National Anthem every morning before school. Ezekiel Ridley, who was the longtime principal of that school, would canvass neighborhoods in an effort to make sure that the students were getting what they needed in terms of food. He created, after school adult education programs for people in the community. He made sure that professional Black Topekans were coming in for programming so that Black students could see the possibilities for Black life. Again, not just focused on deprivation or discrimination, but all, really invested in the development of Black students, not just in terms of their schooling, but also in terms of them as people. And then in preparation for the integration of Black students in junior high schools, because junior high schools and the high school were not segregated. And high schools in the state of Kansas, it was illegal to segregate high schools. There was this sense that Black educators were preparing Black students for these predominantly white spaces, kind of arming them with a strong racial sensibility, in preparation for what they would experience with white peers or with white educators in terms of, anti-Blackness, and underestimating their intellectual capabilities, and, what happens in predominantly white high schools, which is, tracking. So because of Black educators' investment in Black students in these spaces that were not economically deprived, the majority of Black Topekans wanted to keep the all Black elementaries. They did not want Black children to be integrated into predominantly white spaces.
I take it that the Black school preservationists made their objections known to the NAACP lawyers with regard to their legal strategy. If so, what was the reaction by these lawyers?
So the NAACP legal defense attorneys knew that there was resistance to integrating Black elementary schools in Topeka because the local NAACP experienced resistance on the ground, had a hard time, for example, raising funds for their defense. So because of Black resistance to the local NAACP, for example, the local NAACP could not motivate or mobilize Black churches. Black ministers did not want to offend their congregations because most of those congregations were either split or they were made up of Black school preservationists. And the local NAACP knew that without the support of Black ministers, they were not going to get the support of Black congregations and therefore the support of the Black community. That was written, the secretary of the local NAACP, Lucinda Todd, wrote multiple letters to the national office describing the challenges that they were experiencing within the Black community. The president, McKinley Burnett, also wrote letters to the national office describing what he experienced as opposition to the case. And they were very, very clear that it wasn't because of white fears of Black fears of white retaliation. It was because of Black resistance to integrating these elementary schools because they were protecting Black parents and alumni were really invested in protecting the kind of racial sensibilities of Black children as long as they could, protecting them from anti-Blackness in predominantly white spaces. So there's plenty of evidence in the oral histories that were collected by the Kansas State Historical Society on behalf of the Brown Foundation. There's, tons of evidence in the correspondence between the national office and the Topeka branch. The national office, which, in large part wasn't really interested in what was happening on the ground. They were more interested in kind of the national scope of the case. Just did not hear the validity of the concerns that the local branch was expressing in terms of their ability or inability to mobilize the community around desegregating these elementary schools.
So how do Mexican Americans and those of Mexican ancestry fit into your story?
So there has been very little written about the relationship, the kind of relational relationship between people of Mexican descent in Kansas in general, but in terms of these segregated educational spaces and those that were in segregated Black educational spaces. So there was a significant population of people of Mexican descent in Topeka, largely because of the railroad company. So there was a community in Topeka, Oakland, in which was predominantly people of Mexican descent, both, Mexican Americans and people who had immigrated to work for the railroad. And because of the nature of, kind of American racial systems, the local governments did not know what to do with these people who were like not Black and not white. In Topeka, the solution to that was to create what they called a Mexican school, and I'm using that in quotes, which was annexed to a segregated white school. The way in which, white Topekans, and kind of this is consistent across the US, the way in which white Topekans thought of people of Mexican descent is that they were assimilable, which is not how Black people are imagined. Black people are imagined to be permanently different, or, there's this kind of essentialist thinking about Black bodies that did not necessarily exist with people of Mexican descent. So there's this idea that people of Mexican descent could be assimilated into American culture. And these Mexican schools really operated with this kind of push towards Americanization. So in these schools, people of Mexican descent the children of Mexican descent were sent to these schools whether they were American or not, whether they spoke Spanish or not. But there's a sense that with the superintendent, for example, of Topeka Public Schools, argued that by the 4th grade, these students of Mexican descent would be proficient enough in English to be integrated in with white students. So the students of Mexican descent actually suffered more so than Black students who were segregated in Topeka, because there was not an economic investment in these schools. They did not have teachers who were of Mexican descent. They had white teachers who were racist. In the school, they did not have, they had to leave the school to, the water fountain did not exist on their campus. They did not have toilets in the school. There is a lot of discussion in the oral histories around experiencing discrimination at the hands of, these white teachers who did not understand the cultural values of these students. In fact, there were it was so bad that there were a number of people of Mexican descent in Topeka who would send their children to Catholic school, to private schools, instead of having them in the so-called Mexican school. So what ends up happening is that these students end up being integrated. Well, let me just go backwards for a second, because I missed one important point, which is that because of the different racial scripts that are assigned to people of Mexican descent and Black students in the city of Topeka were on this 633 plan, which meant that they went to elementary school until the 6th grade. No, that was white students. They were on a 633. I'm going to mess that up. They weren't integrated until the 8th grade. They were on an 813 plan. That's what it was. So they were not integrated until the 8th grade. They had 1 year in junior high, and then they had 3 years in high school. So Black students stayed in Black schools until they completed the 7th grade. Is that right? 8th grade. So students of Mexican descent were integrated in the 5th grade. So they spent very little time comparatively in segregated elementary schools in relation to Black students. So that's an important point of distinction as well. And that's, again, because students of Mexican descent were considered to be assimilable while Black students were not.
Mm-hmm. You employ the concept of whiteness as property. What do you mean by that?
So that is not my concept. That is the concept that was created by Cheryl Harris, who is one of the kind of founders of critical race theory. And she speaks about whiteness. So the kind of straightforward way in which you can think of whiteness as property is in terms of whites' access to property and the kind of benefits they receive from whiteness in terms of the in terms of land, in terms of like access to, again, kind of not only the ability to buy property, but access to, residential privileges in residential spaces. So when thinking about the property of whiteness, in this instance, not only am I talking about the benefits that are conferred to white Topekans based off of racial policies that give them access to residential spaces or to schools or to public accommodations, but I'm also talking about the investment in this kind of racial identity of whiteness and how they use policy to privilege whiteness in these spaces. So when thinking about the property of whiteness in relation to public schools, what's interesting about Topeka is that unlike in a lot of Southern spaces, and I hate to like lump all Southerners together, but for the purposes of being more simple in approach, I'll do that. Unlike Jim Crow schools in the South, there's not an economic disinvestment in these Black schools in Topeka. So the privileging of whiteness was not conferred in terms of we have more. It was confirmed in terms of we have exclusive white spaces. And a lot of the difference, I have my colleague Laura Polito talks about geography matters. The first couple of chapters of my book really outline how the legacy of Bleeding Kansas is kind of this idea that white Kansans are racially liberal. But the legacy of Bleeding Kansas and this kind of idea, of like the Jayhawkers and the legacy of John Brown is actually that how whiteness is privileged in legislation is more in terms of social discrimination than it is in like the stealing of people's civil rights, Black people's civil rights. So it is illegal, for example, in the state of Kansas to segregate schools unless you can confer equal advantages. So this is in schools that are greater than 15,000. So large cities were not allowed to segregate public schools unless they could have separate and equal facilities. So in Topeka, they adhered to that standard. So they adhered to the Plessy standard. And that's what's, I think, interesting about how whiteness as property operates in Topeka particularly, and it's largely because of the legacy of white settlement and how they were invested in this myth around bleeding Kansas and white liberalism.
Well, in any case, Professor Cheney, author of the book Blacks Against Brown, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
And in closing, we'd like to thank everybody who donated this hour. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Noliwe Rooks, Dr. Charise L. Cheney. Thank you to our co-producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Thank you, Gary Baca. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.